Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Today we'll talk about traffic patterns. Now, a traffic pattern simply is a rectangle where the runway is actually part of one of its sides. And traffic patterns were established to provide a way that ensures that traffic can fly in and out of an airport safely. If there wasn't any defined way to do that, then everyone would just approach an airport and depart an airport in some way. And of course it would be really dangerous and chaos would probably ensue. And that's why traffic patterns were established. So traffic patterns create fixed rules how to depart and approach an airport. And also it defines various terms for certain positions like base, downwind, or so on. We'll come to that in a second. And this just helps determining my own position and also report my position to other traffic, for example. Simply is the traffic pattern is simply there to create an orderly traffic flow. Now, there are differences in different countries, but there are some things that are actually the same almost everywhere in the world regarding traffic patterns. But you should always check local procedures, especially with pattern joining procedures. They may differ from country to country, so always check the local regulations. Now let's look at the layout of a traffic pattern. The legs of the traffic pattern are called upwind or departure leg, actually the same, crosswind, downwind, base, and final. Now, some of these legs refer to the wind condition. For example, the downwind is flown parallel to the runway in the opposite landing direction. So normally, if you're landing into the wind, so your final is into the wind, you will have a downwind on the downwind leg. And also you will have a crosswind on the crosswind leg, hence the names. And then there is base, which is forms a 90-degree angle to the final approach. And then there is a final approach, which is leading you straight to the runway. Normally, in most parts of the world, the traffic pattern standard altitude is 1,000 feet above ground. But there may be differences. For example, at my home airport, the traffic pattern is in 1,500 feet above ground, roughly. So if there are local procedures, be sure to check them, check the charts if they're available or any other local information that you can get on the traffic pattern altitude and any specific traffic pattern rules and regulations that may be just locally valid. Now, normally you should enter the downwind if you're already in the traffic pattern, so you're departing into the upwind leg, then normally you'll fly straight ahead to roughly 500 feet above ground, and then you turn left to the downwind. Ideally, you have reached the traffic pattern altitude when entering the downwind. And then you fly the downwind parallel to the runway. That is probably half a mile to a mile away from the runway, parallel to it. And then you should keep the traffic pattern altitude at least until you beam the landing threshold. And then you reduce the power, reduce the speed, extend your flaps, and start a descent towards the runway, eventually turning base and final. The base turn, of course, is also depending on the actual traffic pattern altitude, but if it's 1,000 feet above ground, it's normally a good rule of thumb to turn base when the landing threshold is roughly 45 degrees behind you. Now, when turning base, this is also valid for the crosswind leg. Mind the crosswind, so always apply wind correction. So if you fly the traffic pattern, it should be really a rectangle above the ground. So always remember to correct for wind. Now, the standard turns in a traffic pattern are to the left. So the left turn pattern is the standard one. However, there are quite a few airports where you have to fly a right-hand pattern to a specific runway. It's exactly the same, just all turns to the right instead of to the left. Just be sure to use the correct phraseology, either if you're talking to the tower or also to other airplanes if it's an uncontrolled field. If you're flying in a right-hand traffic pattern, then the position reports have to include right, so you are then on right base and on right downwind, for example. As I've said, if there are charts or any other information available, then use this on how to fly the traffic pattern. If not, just use the standard rules. At controlled airports, of course, you will fly according to the clearance. The controller might give you instructions like report downwind runway 22 or something like that, or join base. So he will tell you actually what to report and how to enter the traffic pattern. Not so much on an uncontrolled field, but we'll talk about traffic pattern entries in a minute. Just in any case, always remember to look out for traffic. Always scan for traffic. There might be other airplanes in the circuit. On uncontrolled fields, there might be even airplanes without radio in the circuit, so please always have a sharp lookout for other traffic. Also be aware that there can be a real mix of traffic. At an uncontrolled field, maybe you can have 2 airplanes in a traffic pattern, 1 helicopter, and maybe even a jet. There are some uncontrolled fields, for example in Australia, but also in other parts of the world, where actually airline flights make landings. So you could share in your Cessna 152, you could someday share your traffic pattern with a Boeing 737. So keep in mind that those fly at completely different speeds, often also at other altitudes, so they might fly the traffic pattern at 1,500 feet above ground. And then there might be a glider traffic pattern on the other side of the runway, so just be always aware that there can be quite the mix for traffic traveling at different speeds and having different requirements in the traffic pattern. All right, so how to enter the traffic pattern. Now the entry into the pattern is standardized as well. You should always perform a proper entry and also always think about local regulations, because those differ a bit from country to country. Now on a controlled airport, you will get your entry instructions by the tower. For example, join right downwind runway 18, for example. On an uncontrolled field, of course, you have to make up your own entry, and this will of course depend on the direction you're coming from and also of the runway in use. And then there are 2 cases actually. First one is you know the runway in use already because, for example, the airfield has a Unicom, or you've been listening into radio traffic and 3 other aircraft have been using a specific runway. Now, if you don't know the runway direction, that is most basically the wind direction actually, then you have to overfly the field first. So the common procedure is to overfly the airport at least 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude, so normally 1,500 feet or maybe even 2,000 feet, and have a look down at the windsock. And then determine in which direction you're going to land. And also if the strip is free of obstacles or maybe animals or something like that, if the strip condition is suitable. One important thing to remember is never descend into a traffic pattern. Even more so in a low-wing airplane. The Cessna 152 at least is a high-wing airplane, but still, never descend into the traffic pattern because you may descend into other traffic that's already into the pattern. So as soon as you enter one of the legs of the traffic pattern, you should be at traffic pattern altitude. One exception being, of course, if you have just departed into a traffic pattern and you're on upwind or crosswind, of course, you have to climb to traffic pattern altitude first. So traffic pattern is actually, or the area around the airport is actually divided in a live and a dead side. The dead side is where the traffic pattern is not, and the live side is where the traffic pattern is located. So at the example image you can see right here, we have the traffic pattern in the southeast of the runway, so that's the live side, and the other opposite side is the dead side. Now the correct entry depends if you're coming from the dead or the live side. One very standard and nice common entry into the pattern at uncontrolled airfields is to fly a 45-degree entry into the downwind. This gives you opportunity to check for traffic visually, and then you enter the downwind approximately in the middle of the runway, beam in the middle of the runway, or even a bit earlier. If you're coming from the dead side, of course you have to get to the live side first, and then it's depending on the country you're flying in actually. In quite some countries there's the so-called midfield crosswind, so where you're coming from the dead side, and then you actually flying straight across the runway in the middle of the field. That's why it's called midfield crosswind, and from there you enter the downwind at the traffic pattern altitude. That will be the image on the right that you can see here. But this is not the way how it's done in other countries, so be sure to check local regulations. What you can do if in doubt is to simply give the airport a wide berth, a few miles, so that you're definitely outside the traffic pattern, and fly around it to the live side and then just do your 45-degree entry. You should at the very least fly two legs of the traffic pattern when you enter, so at least you should enter on base, but it's preferable to enter on downwind. Entering directly to the final approach, so making a straight-in approach, is not recommended. It's sometimes forbidden, but it's mostly allowed, but it's almost never recommended. The reason is, first of all, you don't know anything about the runway condition, about the wind direction. If you're going straight in, you would see that only at the last moment. If there's another airplane without a radio in the circuit that's just using the opposite runway, that could cause a bad situation, so you have not a lot of opportunity to really fit into traffic. This is something you should only do if you really establish the wind correction beforehand, and if you maybe have coordinated with other traffic what you're about to do. Well, departing from the traffic pattern is pretty easy. Normally you just extend one leg of the traffic pattern. So we have the left-hand pattern here in the image. If you want to go to the southwest, you can just fly straight ahead on the upwind leg. If you want to go to the southeast, you could just extend the crosswind leg and so on. Just announce your intentions on the frequency always, and look out for other traffic. Always use the frequency if it's an uncontrolled field, of course also on a controlled field, but then you have to do anyway. Report frequently, maybe first time 10 miles out. Always descend before you enter the traffic pattern, and keep a constant visual scan. Again, be aware that there may be aircraft that don't have a radio, or they might have a radio but the pilot just doesn't care to talk. So the lookout is really important. What you can also do to improve your chances of being seen is use your exterior lights. So switch on all lights you have so you can be seen more easily. Before you start in an actual traffic pattern, maybe with the stress of additional traffic and so on, you could fly simulated traffic patterns as a practice exercise. So you could go out there in a training area, find a road, a straight piece of road, and let's assume that's the runway, and then fly a traffic pattern around it. Normally for engine failure reasons, you'll probably fly that simulated pattern a bit higher than 1000 feet, so visually it just looks then a bit different than a real pattern, but it can be a good exercise to simply fly a nice rectangle above ground and do all your wind corrections correctly and so on. All right, so we've covered the most basic theory about traffic patterns. So I'd say let's hop into the airplane and actually try one. See you there.